I know I'm getting older because back in my day, meat didn't have a backstory. But today, before you eat it, you got to know something about the life that it lived, whether it was cage-free, free-range, grass-fed. That wasn't a thing in the 80s and 90s, but today, consumers want to know more about the meat that they're going to purchase. And although it's a first in my lifetime, it's new for me, it's not a first in history because the church in Corinth back in the first century, they were arguing over how much information you needed to know before you could purchase meat in the marketplace. Now, you see, we're concerned at times whether the food in our grocery store is organic. Those in Corinth were concerned that the food in their stores was demonic. Many of the merchants, the meat they were selling, they had purchased from pagan temples after it had been offered to idols. And so the Corinthians are wondering, hey, what do we need to know about meat before we eat it? How much of the backstory do we need to understand? And so this morning, I want to turn our attention to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 to try to answer the question, how much do we need to know about what we eat? And that might sound like something that is better suited for a food blog than for Bible study, may not be a particularly riveting question for you, but I promise you, I could preach 10 sermons on this text if we had the time and you had the patience, because it is immensely practical to us. Now, this text will teach us how Christians ought to think about boycotts, what we ought to think about what stores Christians can and cannot shop at. It'll teach us how we ought to think about our work. It'll teach us how we ought to think about our time in retirement. It'll teach us how we ought to handle everything from traffic to trash day. In fact, there is not an aspect of your life that isn't informed by this text on the backstory of meat. And so I want to invite you to join me there, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. If you've got a digital device you can use, I'd encourage you to search for the ESV, the English Standard Version. That's the translation of the Bible I'll be reading from this morning. And so if you search ESV 1 Corinthians 10, you'll be able to follow right along with me. And I'm going to begin reading there the words of the Apostle Paul in verse 14. The Apostle Paul writes, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you're disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. And this is God's word to us today. And here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul is once again addressing the topic of meat that has been offered to idols. He first addressed the topic back in chapter 8. Because throughout Corinth, there are these pagan temples where people would go to worship their false gods by offering a sacrifice of food to the idol that represented the god that they worshiped. And here's the thing with idols, they don't eat. An idol of silver or stone does not have a stomach. And so whatever you put on its plate, it's just going to stay there. And nobody wants to let perfectly good food go to waste. And so after the sacrifice had taken place, the pagan priest would take the meat off the plate and then would go sell it to some salesperson, some merchant in the marketplace, or they might serve it up in the restaurant there in the pagan temple. And back in chapter 8, Paul had agreed with those who'd said, hey, Paul, we know that there is only one true God. And so Zeus, Aphrodite, Poseidon, they're just the creation of the imagination of man. They have no real power in and of themselves. And Paul agreed with them. But here in chapter 10, Paul circles back around to remind the church at Corinth and to remind you and me that while false gods may be fake, demons are real. And so he says in verse 15, essentially this: when we drink the cup at the Lord's Supper, when we eat the bread, we're not literally drinking Christ's blood or literally eating Christ's body, but we are participating in a spiritual act that represents those realities. And so, although we are always in God's presence, if I ascend to the heights of the Himalayas, God is there. If I descend to the depths of the sea, God is there. We are always in God's presence. When we observe the Lord's Supper with the Lord's people on the Lord's day, God is especially present. God is present with us in a special way. Again, he says, verse 18, think of those who go to take their tithes to the altar. Think of the people of Israel as they take the tithe of their flock or their harvest and they go and they offer it as a sacrifice to the Lord. The law commanded for them to consume part of their tithe in the presence of the Lord at the altar. And so they'd take, some of their corn and some of their goat and they would feast on it there in front of the altar in God's presence. And that food wasn't magic. It was just like the rest of the stuff that they had harvested. But when they ate it there at the altar, they ate it in a way that made God especially present to them. So Paul says, verse 20, when you go into a pagan temple and they are participating in pagan worship, it is true, all of these false gods are phony. They are fake. Zeus is pretend, but he says there are demons that stand behind these idols that are looking to deceive the people. And while Zeus may be pretend and have no power, Satan and his demons, they've got plenty of it. And so when you enter a pagan temple and you participate in pagan worship, you better look out, because you are eating in the presence of demons there the way you eat in the presence of the Lord when you take the Lord's Supper. You see his argument? That's what he is saying to the people. And so he's saying, look, Christians cannot eat meat in a pagan temple as part of pagan worship, because to do so is to participate with demons, and you cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. But then Paul turns around and he says in verse 25, that while you can't eat meat offered to idols there in the pagan temple, you can purchase whatever meat you want from the marketplace without asking any questions about its backstory. You don't need to know if that meat was grass-fed or fed to idols. You can just purchase it and move on. And that may seem contradictory. Whoa, Paul, didn't you just say that this was demon meat? Why can we eat this meat in the market if we can't eat it in the temple? But I want you to notice Paul's logic here. If you're to go home this afternoon and you were to go into your pantry and you were to find some of the same crackers that we use when we take the Lord's Supper here in a couple weeks, and you open your fridge and you grab some grape juice and you pour it in a cup, and it happens to be the same kind of juice we use when we celebrate the Lord's Supper here, and you eat that cracker and you drink that juice, are you eating in the presence of the Lord the way we will when we observe the Lord's Supper here in 2 weeks? No. There are times when crackers and grape juice are simply a snack. Or if we fast forward 2 weeks and you show up and we partake of the Lord's Supper and you decide, I'm going to just take an extra cracker, I'm going to take an extra cup, and you carry them home with you. And you wait a couple of days and then you decide, I'm going to eat this cracker and I'm going to drink this cup. Are you eating in the presence of the Lord the same way you are when we gather here and we observe the supper together on the Lord's Day? No. And Paul is saying in the same way that is true of the elements of the Lord's Supper, it is also true when it comes to this meat offered in these temples. That the meat isn't magically transformed into something else. It isn't tainted by demons. As soon as you get that meat out of that context in the pagan temple as part of pagan worship, it is fine for you to consume it. And so Christians cannot eat meat in a pagan temple as part of pagan worship because they're eating in the presence of demons. But as soon as that meat leaves that context, you're free to eat it. In fact, he says, verse 27, if an unbeliever invites you to their home, you can eat whatever they set before you without asking any questions. But he says, verse 28, if you go to an unbeliever's home and they set before you a plate of food, and right as they set it in front of you, they say, this was offered to Zeus. Now you can't eat it. You have to abstain. Not because the meat is tainted or because your conscience is going to be clouded, but because you care for that unbeliever. And you don't want to confuse them about Christianity. You don't want to sit there and quietly eat and them conclude, Jesus must just be like Zeus or Poseidon or Aphrodite, just another one of a number of gods. And so Paul's teaching to the church at Corinth is Christians cannot eat meat offered to pagan gods in pagan temples as a part of pagan worship, but you can eat the meat in any other context as long as there aren't unbelievers who might draw the wrong conclusions about Christianity. Now, that may seem really remote. I have never been offered food that was sacrificed to an idol. Not a very common occurrence in the West. So you may look at a text like this and think, okay, what does this have to do with me? But I promised you I could preach 10 sermons on it. I'm not going to do that this morning. You're going to get out on time, I promise. But I am going to try to preach 6 mini sermons, and I'm going to give you 6 points of application that we could expound on for much longer if we had the time this morning. And the first thing I want you to see that this text teaches us is that presence is powerful both for good or for harm. Presence is powerful both for good or for harm. In 2 weeks, we're going to observe the Lord's Supper here. And those of us who are gathered here as we take the Lord's Supper, God is going to be present with us in a special way in the supper. Now, if you're at home, you can watch a church service on TV. You could participate in one online. You might even have your own crackers and grape juice at home. But God will not be present with you there the way he is with us here when we gather in the Lord's presence on the Lord's Day with the Lord's people to observe the Lord's Supper. You see, we live in a day and an age when we like to talk about the way in which we can be connected online. We live in a world of Zoom calls and live streams, but as Admiral Mike McCullen said at the National Defense University, virtual presence is actual absence. Physical presence is powerful. It is powerful both for good and for harm. And so it also means that if you say to yourself, I'm going to go just check out a Buddhist service or a Muslim service or a Mormon service. I don't believe any of that stuff. I know that those gods, they're false. I just want to go see what it's about. Paul is saying you ought to watch out there. Because while there is only one true God, there are demons who stand behind all of the false gods. And if you gather in the presence of demons. It is dangerous for you. Secondly, this text teaches us that Christians shouldn't just ask if something is legal, but should ask if it is loving. And notice there in verses 23 and 24, Paul quotes the Corinthians. He says, yes, all things are lawful. He responds and he says, but not all things are helpful. He quotes them again, all things are lawful, but not all things build up. Paul is saying that Christians shouldn't make their decisions by what they can get away with or what is allowed, but Christians should be making their decisions based on what is good for others. How can I make a decision that would build others up? One of my mentors, Dr. Bruce Waltke, he defined righteousness this way. He says, righteousness is disadvantaging yourself to advantage others. Righteousness is disadvantaging yourself to advantage others. Notice how Paul puts it there in verse 33. He says, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Righteousness is disadvantaging yourself to advantage others. And the reason our society is in the mess that it is in is because far too many of us are looking for ways to advantage ourselves by disadvantaging others. We are looking for legal loopholes we can use to secure our advantage. And I don't want to get on my soapbox because I could get on and I could talk for hours, but let me just try to demonstrate it with one example. The history of contracts. You know, why do contracts exist? Contracts were created in order to create trust and to protect both parties. If I need to loan seed from you, if I've got to borrow that seed so I can plant it in the ground, and then I say, I'll pay you back at harvest. If you don't know me, you don't know my people, you don't know if you can trust me, a contract is really helpful because the contract guarantees you that I will pay you back at harvest or else I will be under the penalty of law. And so the contract protects you. But the contract also protects me because it guarantees that you won't change the terms of our agreement once the seed is in the ground. And so the contract creates trust and it protects both parties. But now, fast forward into our world, our modern world today, and how are contracts used? I mean, how many contracts do you come in contact with every single day? You know those terms of service agreements? You get those long lines of text that you got to scroll down to the bottom before you can check the box and click accept. I mean, they're everywhere, aren't they? In fact, some websites and services, you don't even have to click accept. Just by showing up on the website or taking part of the service automatically opts you into this terms of service agreement because there is some fine print somewhere at the bottom of the page. And who are those contracts designed to protect? Are they looking to create trust and protect both parties? Did you have any say in that contract, any ability to negotiate its terms? No, that contract has been created because contracts are used today so that the creator of the contract can advantage himself against the other, so that the company might be advantaged over and against the user. And the problem we have is that we no longer seem to care if terms are loving. We just care if they're legal. And so a few years ago, we had a woman reach out to the church. She lived out in our community and she needed some financial assistance. And in December, she had borrowed $300 in order to purchase Christmas gifts for her family from one of the payday loan places here in Buda. The terms of that contract were that she were to pay $100 a month on that loan, and she called us in May. She'd paid $100 a month every month for 5 months. She'd paid $500 on her $300 loan. And when we called the operation, they told us she owed another $300. We went and we looked at the terms of that contract. The interest rate was 320%. Is that loving? But you better believe it is legal. And that seems to be all that we care about these days. How much would we stand apart from the surrounding culture if, as Christians, we didn't simply ask the question, is this legal? But we asked, is it loving? Is this not simply good for me, but is it good for others? How can I disadvantage myself so that I might advantage those around me? Third, text teaches us that obedience to Jesus requires both wisdom and nuance. That obedience to Jesus requires both wisdom and nuance. If you were to ask the Apostle Paul, hey, Paul, can Christians eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols? What would his answer be? If you said, Paul, I just need a black and white, yes or no, what could he say? He'd say, well, all I can tell you is it depends. Depends on the context, depends on the circumstances. It's interesting, isn't it, when you look at the issue of circumcision, when Paul takes Timothy under his wing in Lystra, Paul has Timothy circumcised so as to not offend the Jews there at Lystra. But when Paul takes Titus under his wing in Galatia, Paul refuses for Titus to be circumcised in order that he might offend the Jews in Galatia. Because he wants those in Galatia to understand very clearly that a believer doesn't have to be circumcised in order to be saved. Paul makes different decisions in different places based on different circumstances. Following Jesus requires not simply an understanding of black and white rules, although there are many of those in the Scripture. Adultery is never acceptable. I am required to provide for my children. There are some black and white, many black and white principles in the Bible, but the Bible also teaches us over and over again that in order to follow Jesus faithfully, we need to know God's word and we need to know it well because we are faced with some difficult decisions in life. The first church I pastored was in Mejia, Texas, and there was a family that lived across the highway from the church. And not long after I'd been there, we'd had a church fellowship. We had some pizza left over, and I thought, well, I'll cross the highway, and I'll take the pizza over to this family and try to invite them to church. So I carry the pizza across the highway. I knock on the door, and a voice inside the house tells me, oh, just come on in. And so I turn the doorknob, and the doorknob falls off. I push the door open, and I walk in, and immediately I'm in the kitchen. No one's in the kitchen, and I can see that in the home, there are no doors. All of the rooms simply have beach towels hanging from the frames. I can hear someone talking to me from the back, but they're not coming out, and there are silverfish just swarming all over the place. And the voice from the back tells me, hey, leave the pizza on the table. And so I do, and I leave. And that starts a relationship between me and this family. And in time, the woman of the house comes and she meets with me, and she says, Aaron, I don't know what to do. Here's the situation I'm in, and I don't know what would be pleasing to God. You see, the man that I'm living with, I'm not married to him. We've been living together for a long time. He's terminally ill. He's dying with cancer. And if I marry him, the state is going to garnish my wages because he owes back child support. And I'm the only one in the household who gets a paycheck. I have to provide for all of us and my 3 grandsons because their dad is in prison and their mom has a drug problem. We didn't cover that one in seminary. Like, you can't just flip to a chapter and verse and you don't get a black and white answer of what you do in those circumstances. That requires you to know God's word and to know it well and to be able to apply it with wisdom and nuance in a very complicated situation in life. Fourth, the text teaches us that Christians are free to participate in the immoral marketplace. That Christians are free to participate in the immoral marketplace. Sometimes as believers, I think we act as though we ought to boycott every business that funds immorality in any way. And there may be times when a boycott is wise and an effective course of action. But I want you to notice what Paul instructs the Corinthians to do here in our text in verse 25. He tells them, eat whatever is sold in the market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. He's telling the Corinthians, hey, you don't need to know the backstory of the meat. You don't need to know where it came from. You don't need to know how it was sourced. Now, I want you to think about the implications of that. They know that much, if not most of the meat in the market has been offered to idols. And when they purchase that meat, aren't they funding pagan worship? I mean, when they make that purchase, they are paying for the practices of these pagan temples. They're putting money in the coffers of those pagan temples and those pagan priests. And yet notice Paul says, not your problem. It's not something you have to worry about. You don't have to, do your research and find out where it came from. You just go about your business in the marketplace. You purchase what you need to purchase and you move on. Because he says there in verse 26, he quotes from Psalm 24, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. It all belongs to the Lord anyway. And I don't know about you, but I find that incredibly freeing. Because when I look at our economy, I find that there is not a single dollar that isn't dirty. We joke about Chick-fil-A being Christian chicken. But every time you purchase a chicken sandwich there at Chick-fil-A, they use the money that you paid them to pay their employees who will do who knows what with that money. A part of that money goes to the delivery driver who hauls food, and he uses that money to buy a drink at the convenience store that uses it to buy inventory from Frito-Lay. And I mean, that's we're just starting the chain. I mean, you can see how money is moving around in our economy constantly, and so there is not a dollar that isn't dirty. And if as Christians, we couldn't make any purchases that in any way funded immorality, we could just never purchase anything at all. And so Paul says, look, Christians are free to participate in the immoral marketplace. Fifth, Paul says Christians ought not to cause unnecessary offense. But there are times as Christians when we must cause offense in order to not confuse the conscience of others. That Christians shouldn't cause unnecessary offense. But there are times when as Christians we must cause offense in order to not confuse the conscience of others. Oftentimes people walk away from these verses with Paul's statement there in verse 32. Paul says, give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do. And some people walk away from this text and they'll say, okay, I get it. As a Christian, I'm supposed to never offend anyone. That's my aim. But you got to pair what Paul says in verse 32 with what he says in verses 27 and 28. In verse 27, Paul says, if one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it. That's incredibly offensive, isn't it? I mean, imagine you're invited to dinner at one of your neighbor's homes, and you go over and they've got the barbecue grill going. You can smell that steak cooking, and your mouth is watering. And as they set it down in front of you, and there's all kinds of garlic butter, you're ready to dig in, they say, oh, by the way, this was offered to Zeus. Paul says in that moment, you've got to refuse to eat what your host has graciously provided for you. That's offensive. Not only is it offensive because you're refusing to eat what they've provided for you as their guest, you're also calling into question their religious practice. That's offensive. And yet Paul says if you were to sit there and just quietly consume that meat, you would confuse their conscience as to what Christianity believes. And they would get the idea that Jesus is just like Zeus or Poseidon or Aphrodite, just another one of a number of gods. And so Christians shouldn't seek to cause unnecessary offense. Like if you know some Christians, and I know some people who name the name of Christ and they are kind of proud that they cause offense to people, those kind of folks, you ought to question, have you really met the Lord? Do you really know him? But there are times where Christians must cause an offense in order not to confuse the conscience of others. We cause an offense out of a desire to love our neighbors well. And so if corporate sends pins for employees to wear during Pride Month, you shouldn't shout and cause a stir and cause a scene. But you also shouldn't wear the pin out of a fear that, like, look, if I don't put this on, it might offend someone. So I'm just going to wear it, and I don't want to offend anyone. But Paul would say, no. You don't have to create a scene. You don't have to preach a sermon, but you can just quietly not wear the pin because you don't want to confuse anyone's conscience about what Christianity teaches. There are times as Christians when we must cause an offense in order to not confuse the conscience of others. Sixth, and finally, Paul teaches here in this text that all of life is worship. That all of life is worship. There in verse 31, Paul writes, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God." Paul is saying that every decision in life, down to what you eat and what you drink, ought to be made with, how can I do this in a way that would point people to the Lord? Every decision in life ought to be thinking, how can I disadvantage myself in order to advantage others? And that's difficult to do, isn't it? When I first came to this church, I came as the children's minister. I left the pastorate and became a children's minister, and my mentors all told me, hey, don't do it. Your career will be over. You'll never preach again. And they'd check in with me from time to time and say, hey, how's it going there at Hayes Hills? And I'd tell them, man, I've got the greatest gig in the world. Because with Pastor David, whenever I do something that goes well, I get all the credit. And whenever I make a mistake, I get none of the blame. That's a good gig, isn't it? You get all the credit when things go well and none of the blame when you make a mistake. But that's how Pastor David treated me then. It's how he's treated me for 12 years since. He sought to disadvantage himself, to jump on the grenades in order to advantage others. Can you imagine what it would be like to have a boss like that? To work for someone who didn't try to steal your credit when you were successful on some project? And a boss who didn't try to shift blame to you, not only didn't try to shift blame to you, but even when you were to blame and you did make the mistake, they just took all the heat so that you didn't have to. And Paul is saying that's how we ought to operate in our lives. And the only way you can operate that way, the only way Pastor David is able to operate that way is because his heart, it has been saturated by the gospel of Jesus Christ. You see, what the gospel teaches us is that Jesus disadvantaged himself to advantage others. Notice there in chapter 10, verse 33, Paul says, look, here's what I do. I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. So you ought to imitate me in this as I imitate Christ. That's what Jesus did. He left his place of power and authority in heaven to be born as a baby in Bethlehem. He lived a hard and difficult life in which he was poor, mistreated, mocked, crucified, and killed. He was disadvantaged so that we might be advantaged. He rose from the dead on the third day after dying to take the penalty for your sin and mine, so that if we would put our hope and our trust not in who we are and what we have done, but in who Jesus is and what he has done, we would get all of the credit that belongs to him and none of the blame that we deserve for what we have done. That's the good news of the gospel. We get all of the credit that belongs to Jesus, and we get none of the blame that we rightfully deserve, because he has disadvantaged himself to advantage others. And if you want to be able to live that way in your life, the only way you can begin to stop looking out for yourself, to stop looking out for number one, is to have a full and firm confidence in this reality that Jesus is already looking out for you. Jesus has got that covered, and so you don't have to look out for you. And then you're freed to look out for the good of those around you. And so, Hays Hills, whether we eat or drink or whatever we do, may we do it all to the glory of God, disadvantaging ourselves to advantage others that they might be saved.